Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for the kind compliments from the gentleman. In the morning, we will vote on a budget agreement. Mr. President, I will vote no. And I think it's useful and important for my constituents to understand my thinking and the basis for which I reached that conclusion. One of the most important issues that, in my mind, that we face in this country today is the fiscal condition of our country. And the amount of debt that we incur and the amount of debt that we continue to incur is a significant drag on our economy, on job creation, and in reality on the American dream. It's an economic issue, and at some point in time, if we don't get our fiscal house in order, we will pay a significant price. And we can either deal with this issue in a gradual, incremental way in which we set ourselves on a path to right, or we can wait for the crisis to occur, which I have no doubt will happen. And while it's often said this is an economic issue and fiscal issues matter to the country, I also would point out that this is not just an economic issue, it's a moral issue. The borrowing of money to pay for services and goods that the government provides the American people is a selfish circumstance in which we take the benefits, so-called benefits, of government programs today and expect the future generations of Americans to pay for those benefits. It is wrong economically for us to continue down the path of fiscal irresponsibility, but it is also morally wrong to expect someone else to pay for the so-called benefits we receive today. Now, this issue today, this Budget Act, this bipartisan effort to resolve the circumstance we find ourselves in because we face a debt limit problem. The problem is that if we don't do something, that then we reach the debt limit, and there are those who will argue that the consequences of not raising the debt ceiling are so dramatic, so damaging, that we need to do that regardless of the fiscal consequences of doing so. I come down on the side of fiscal responsibility, and I want to explain why. I want Kansans to know how I think about this issue. And in fact, one of the first letters I ever wrote to President Obama as a new United States Senator, March of 2011, was an explanation to the President that he needed to work with Congress. And I offered to work with the President and the administration, my colleagues in the Congress, in the Senate, to see if we couldn't find a solution so that when we raise the debt ceiling, we actually do something that changes the course, the path of spending that we're on. And I explained to Kansans by publishing that letter and explaining my comments to the President, the letter to the President, what I believed was important, most important. And unfortunately, since 2011, we are no more on a course of fiscal sanity than we were when I wrote the letter to the President. And here's the point I want to make. If we give up the leverage, the opportunity that this issue presents to us as members of Congress to force us to do things that we apparently don't have the will, the courage, the political desire to do, how will we ever get it done? So again, I would guess there will be editorialists, certainly across the country, perhaps a few in Kansas, who will say, you need to raise the debt ceiling because it's irresponsible not to. But isn't it also true that it's irresponsible simply to raise the debt ceiling every time we meet it? If you don't take advantage of the circumstance we're in to force ourselves to do the things that need to be done, we are irresponsible. I read a lot of history. I've studied our country as a private citizen, and I've been involved in the political process here in Washington in trying to resolve problems our country faces for a few years. And here's an observation. Things have changed over time. It used to be a bipartisan desire, a bipartisan understanding that balancing the budget was important. One of the things that's changed over time is there no longer seems to be the desire on the part of many in Congress. Many don't see it. And in my view, Democrats in particular don't see deficits as a bad thing. We look the other way. And so maybe in days gone by in which there was broad consensus from Republican presidents, Democrat presidents, that balancing the budget was something that mattered, that reducing the debt, at least over time, was important, that when we incurred expenditures going to war, that we paid for them. That was something that was generally believed across the country by the vast majority of Americans and by the vast majority of members of Congress, regardless of what political party they associate with. That consensus, that drive, that insistence that we do that no longer exists, which highlights for me the necessity of using this issue of whether or not the debt ceiling should be raised to determine what we should do about reducing spending, reducing the debt, figuring out what the balance is between taxes and expenditures is all the more important. If I had any faith that this Congress, this president were going to deal with the deficit, regardless of what happened with the debt ceiling, then I wouldn't be interested in using the debt ceiling as a tool to force change in behavior in Washington, D.C. But unfortunately, Mr. President, I have no faith that there are enough people here who care enough about the deficit to do something about it unless we are forced to do so. And at the moment, the only tool that I have is to insist we use this opportunity in which we're requested to raise the debt ceiling. We use this opportunity to change the course our country is on in regard to spending and deficits. Again, the argument may be by some it's irresponsible. In fact, I've heard so many times, all we're doing is authorizing the borrowing of money to pay for the things we've already encumbered. Well, Mr. President, wouldn't it seem a better solution for us to quit encumbering over time rather than coming after the fact and saying, let's raise the debt ceiling? But the reality apparently is there's no will to do that. So we can say it's irresponsible not to raise the debt ceiling. We can say we're only paying for the things we've already decided to spend money on. But if that's the only thing we say, we never take it to the necessary step of doing anything about the problem. Mr. President, it's irresponsible not to use this opportunity to force us to behave in ways that is good for the country today, that is economically solid and sound, that is morally correct. Borrowing money ad infinitum is not an option for this country under either economic or moral circumstances. And Mr. President, it's irresponsible for us to once again decide we'll try to solve this problem later. I've always thought that the most important political issue we face, the one that is important most to the country since I was elected to the United States Senate, was how do we make certain that the economy is growing and there's job opportunities and people feel secure in their employment and they have the opportunity to advance their careers. They have the sense that they're saving for their kids' education, that they're saving for their own retirement. And this issue of the fiscal condition of our country inhibits the ability for that economic security to be available to Americans. I would conclude, Mr. President, by saying we need to do what is responsible, and the responsible thing is to make certain that we pay our way and that we don't expect others to do so in the future. And to only say that we have to reach this agreement in order to avoid greater challenges in our country is to walk away from something that I think is a primary and important responsibility of Congress and the President. It's unfortunate. In my time in service in the Senate, President Obama has been the president. But I've seen no political will on the part of this administration to do anything about the long-term consequences of spending more money than we have. That means we have no choice but to insist that something be done. And the only opportunity before us is this question of whether or not the debt ceiling should be raised without corresponding reductions in spending. And in my view, Mr. President, those reductions in spending take priority. It is important. Our primary responsibility as American citizens, as an American citizen, not just as a United States Senator, but all of us as American citizens, we have a responsibility to do two things for the future of our country: protect and preserve the freedoms and liberties guaranteed by our Constitution, and to make sure that the American dream is alive and well, that future Americans have the chance to pursue their dreams in this country. Mr. President, to continue to borrow money, to put our country's fiscal condition in jeopardy once again, means that we will have failed that responsibility, because the spending and borrowing of money inhibits our personal liberties and freedoms and reduces the economic opportunity, the American dream for all Americans. Mr. President, I will vote no. Mr. President, I yield the floor to the gentlewoman from Nebraska.